Have you ever been to a national park? The Grand Canyon, or the Everglades, or Yosemite maybe? What if I told you about a national park that is now beneath a lake? This is Glen Canyon, which has been called our Lost National Park. An area known for incredible rock formation and natural bridges, and was inhabited by Native Americans for thousands of years, now largely under Lake Powell due to the construction of a huge dam that flooded the area in 1963.
No longer would this be a river. Lake Powell was born, a sapphire lake of matchless beauty.
Writer Edward Abbey said that the turning of Glen Canyon into a lake was like the Taj Mahal being buried in mud. And Glen Canyon is not alone. Other iconic federal lands continue to be threatened.
President Donald Trump signed 2 proclamations in Salt Lake City Monday, scaling back the size of 2 national monuments in Utah.
And are forcing us to assess the role of our public lands.
We're writing letters to stop it.
Who are public lands for? The government, the people, or private industry? What exactly are public lands? National parks or national forest, or what? And what does their future look like? In addition to outdoor videos like this, Greenbelly also makes ready-to-eat adventure meals. Greenbelly meals are 650-calorie meal bars loaded with nutrition like protein, carbs, fats, sodium, and fiber. Greenbelly meals have been called Rice Krispie treats on steroids and come in 5 flavors using all natural ingredients. If you have an outdoor adventure coming up or just want a nutritionally robust, ready-to-eat meal, check us out at greenbelly.com. Simply put, public lands are lands that are owned by the government, federal, state, or local, or by a sovereign tribal nation. The majority of U.S. public lands are held in trust for the American people by the federal government and cover about 670 million acres, which is a whopping 27% of the entire country. And the vast majority of these public lands are concentrated in these 12 western states. How the land designation is broken down gets, let's just say, complicated.
There's a lot of different designations, and all these different designations, they serve different purposes, which is part of why it gets a little complicated.
For starters, there are a lot of public land categories, roughly 25, from national seashores to national grasslands. We'll focus on federal public lands. How each of these types of lands are designated depends on the variety of factors like their level of legal protection, their intended use, and what governing body or bodies are managing them. There are really just 5 main ones though. National parks. These are typically reserved for areas with exceptional natural beauty and unique ecosystems. The Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone, and the Great Smoky Mountains to name a few. National forests. These are vast expanses of land reserved for multiple use, meaning everything from recreation to things like timber production. National wildlife refuges. As the name implies, these are important wildlife areas to preserve habitats and biodiversity. National monuments. These are presidential designations, similar to national parks, but typically much smaller and more defined. The Devil's Tower in Wyoming, even the Statue of Liberty. BLM lands. These are similar to national forest, however, they're managed by the Bureau of Land Management instead of the U.S. Forest Service. Where did the land originally come from? Well, to oversimplify, some 1700s and early 1800s events. After gaining independence from England, the American colonies consolidated, and in the process, states ceded their land to the newly formed U.S. federal government. There was also the tragic forced displacement of Native Americans from their land. And there were large land purchases and annexations, like the Louisiana Purchase, annexation of Texas, and Alaska Purchase. By 1867, the federal government had control over a crazy amount of land. The US's goal was not entirely focused on conservation, though. The US wanted to incentivize Western settlement. With legislation like the Homestead Act of 1862, more and more lands became privatized to individuals and corporations. As these lands underwent rapid development, there became a growing national concern about conservation. In response, Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872, which is widely recognized to be the world's first national park. President Grant famously said, "This bill is the best bill I ever signed." Between 1890 and 1945, around 200 million acres were set aside, forming more national parks, forests, and refuges. It's worth mentioning Theodore Roosevelt here, who also established the U.S. Forest Service and signed the Antiquities Act into law, which has been used more than 100 times since. Setting aside federal land for conservation and public use was a big deal. It set a precedent not only within the United States, but internationally. It's now estimated that 115 countries have their own national parks. Okay, so we got all these public lands largely before our lifetimes. What do they do though? Recreation. Possibly the most obvious, these lands are America's playground. Ecological.
They're called ecosystem services, things that are basically just any benefit that a human can get from the natural environment. Things like water quality and flood control.
Obviously, clean air and clean water are vital for wildlife and our existence. Historical. Our public lands also function as an outdoor museum, preserving indigenous history and archaeological treasures. Natural resources. Public lands act like a national piggy bank for storing things like timber, coal, oil, gas, precious metals, and minerals. Economic. National parks, forests, and monuments attract millions of visitors each year. Despite their importance, American public lands are constantly facing threats. Policy changes. While there are laws and regulations in place to protect public lands, they will always be at risk of rollbacks and shifts in policy made by the revolving door of presidential administrations.
Federal public lands can be sold, existing protections can be undone.
For example, in the Trump administration alone, Trump unprotected an area the size of Florida in what is known as the largest elimination of protected areas in US history. Fast forward a few years and contrast that to the more conservation-minded Biden administration. Biden rolled back and restored what Trump unprotected, including things like protections to Bear Ears Monument and Grand Staircase Escalante.
A decade of ambition and innovation to preserve our shared future.
They know that this is a fight that's not over.
The point is not to take jabs at what administrations have done right or wrong, rather to highlight how volatile and inconsistent our conservation efforts can be depending on the priorities of the particular presidential administration. There have been some budget cut proposals in the past that have left many alarmed. For example, a roughly $1.4 billion cut to the Department of Interior was proposed in 2018.
Funding to the Park Service has been relatively stagnant for a long time. You'll also see major staffing issues in a lot of parks. Now we're really trying to figure out how to reach the best measures with what resources we do have.
While Congress has mostly rejected these in the past, they are proposed regularly and still pose a significant threat to adequately manage and preserve the lands. Resource extraction. Ensuring we don't over-extract the natural resources these lands contain can be tricky. These include above-ground resources like timber, but also coal, oil, natural gas, and precious metals. Over-extracting any of these would produce economic gains in the short term, making the fight to preserve that much more difficult for the long term.
Public lands can be leased. Some of the biggest oil and gas companies can have hundreds or even thousands of leases.
Even if you have these protected lands, the areas outside of it are very important. Pollutants can travel through water and go a long way.
Transfer of lands from federal to state. Some states are seeking the transfer of federal public lands to the state level, especially in states like Utah, where public lands constitute about 70% of the state. The transfer of land from federal to state poses a number of concerns about responsible management. This 2019 report from Headwaters Economics shows that while the transfer generates more revenue for the state also faces new and increased expenses for maintenance of those lands, which can lead to the state eventually selling off the lands or exploiting resources to meet spending needs. This is clear in states like Texas, which has sold off 41 million acres of its land, and now just over 1% of the state remains for public use.
Idaho's federal lands transfer to state control.
So our public lands are under fire. They've largely stood the test of time through dozens of presidential administrations and economic downturns, though. How? Government. Yes, the government can taketh, but it can also giveth, like the Wilderness Act of 1964, which designated and protected large areas and prohibited activities like logging, mining, and motorized vehicles. Or the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which requires federal agencies to ensure that their actions do not jeopardize the existence of listed species. For example, our national emblem, the bald eagle, was on the brink of extinction in the 1980s due to habitat destruction and a particularly harmful pesticide called DDT. The Endangered Species Act helped reverse its decline from a critically low 400 breeding pairs to a flourishing 300,000 individuals. The act has also been instrumental in saving American alligator, grizzly bear, and gray wolf populations. One more particularly noteworthy piece of conservation legislation to mention here was the Antiquities Act of 1906, which grants the president the authority to designate national monuments.
It's one of the foundational public lands laws. That law has been used by multiple different presidents to protect really important places.
National monuments.
A national monument.
National monuments. National monument.
While no law is entirely immune to changes, they provide a legal foundation for the protection of public lands, and modifications to them can require arduous congressional approval. The public. In addition to government agencies, there are many conservation groups fighting for public land protection, not to mention the vast majority of American citizens.
The fact that a lot of public land is not formally protected means that the public has a huge role to play. A lot of grassroots movements are the reason that a lot of, especially recent monuments, are in place.
Every year, parks are reaching the highest level of visitation that they have ever seen. Whether it's the employees, whether it's a visitor who cares about their public lands, these are going to be, at the end of the day, the ones who protect it.
Studies like Winning the West from 2018 found that 76% of Americans support the concept of increasing conservation on federal public lands. In a seemingly toxic and increasingly polarized political climate, the conservation of public lands generally continues to be something we can all agree on.
It's one of the issues that is consistently and strongly supported, and in a bipartisan way.
It's not fair to say all human development and privatization of public lands is bad. Clearly, we need things like industry to prioritize the economy and to build things like dams. Striking the right balance between conservation and industry is the goal, and our public lands continue to be at the forefront of that debate.
I truly believe many of this nation's greatest treasures reside on our public lands. The most progress is where you can find shared visions, shared goals, and then work together.
A big thanks to Nick Lashley from the National Park Service and Mariel Lutz from the Center for American Progress for their help making this video. We're a small team that loves the outdoors and spend a lot of time researching and creating these videos. If you like this video and want to see more deep dives from us on what's going on in the outdoors, we'd love for you to support us by subscribing to Greenbelly's channel. Hike on!